Thank you, Tony. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Tony has just said, 2015, I'm reversing back to the future. 2015 has been a landmark year for all of us who have concerns for sustainable development and climate change. Just 2 months ago, the United Nations adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this December, about 190 countries will again gather for the United Nations Climate Change Conference, hopefully to work towards a universal agreement on climate change. In fact, I'll be flying off this Sunday to Paris for a preparatory meeting for the December conference. Sustainable development and climate change concern all of us, but they are particularly salient for small island states, the small island developing states who are amongst the most vulnerable in the world. In Singapore, 700 square kilometers, low-lying, 25% of our land reclaimed from the sea. We are acutely conscious of our vulnerability. And Singapore is both a small island developing state and a city state. So in a sense, if you want concentration of risk, this is it. And that is why our long-standing policy has been to pursue sustainable development, not as an ideology, but as a matter of practical consideration for long-term survival. And that's also why we have always supported global efforts to reduce carbon emissions in a fair and sustainable way. And also, we recognize that it is our duty, our duty to our own citizens to prepare and build up resilience against the deleterious effects of climate change if global agreements do not pan out. There are two key attributes that define Singapore's approach to sustainable development. First, pragmatism, and second, a belief in effective partnerships. Let me deal with the first aspect, pragmatism. The Singapore government takes a practical approach that's focused on the long-term interests of the country, even if it is initially unpopular. And we believe that there are three dimensions: a thriving economy, an inclusive society, and a sustainable development are all elements that are essential in order to create a virtuous cycle of development. And that's worth repeating. A thriving economy, in other words, businesses have to survive and have to generate value. An inclusive society that remembers we're not here just to generate shareholder returns, but that every citizen has a stake in the future. And third, a sustainable environment. Because if you truly believe in democracy, and you realize that we all breathe the same air, drink the same water, eat the same food, then you need to believe in a sustainable long environment for the long term. From the outset in Singapore, we knew that we could not run away from the challenges of rising urbanization and sustainability, especially not in a land-scarce city. Our founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, had to make hard and painful decisions, counterintuitive even, in order to ensure that our development did not come at the expense of the environment. He was a greenie before it became fashionable to be green. And let me give you an example. 50 years ago, when Singapore was much less developed, and our per capita GDP was 1/10 of what it is today, Mr. Lee rejected cheap, dirty, coal-fired power stations. He instinctively understood that there was value in having a blue sky, clear water, and unpolluted land. In a sense, because we are so small and we're so crowded, there is no forgotten backyard where you can dump your junk, where you can dump toxic waste. Everyone's backyard is someone else's front yard in Singapore. And so we have a city-state that obsessively avoids pollution of our air, our water, and our land. Singapore has also leveraged technology to enable our different stakeholders to address climate change and our other environmental challenges. So for instance, in our latest Sustainable Singapore Blueprint, we set out our vision for a Singapore which would be a city that would be both smart and sustainable, that in housing projects that will come, we will introduce and roll out smart technologies in order to be able to sense in real time all our environmental parameters, to provide that data and make it available in an open and transparent way to all the stakeholders, and to reward people who are doing the right thing, are providing value, and similarly, to also expose those who are achieving short-term benefits at the expense of everyone else. Singapore aims to be a leading green economy where governments and businesses work together in order to create an ecosystem of supporting infrastructure and policies that will collectively enable us to be energy efficient, to be water efficient, to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce waste, and to reduce pollution. And these are not just ideological statements. Remember that in Singapore, these are essential for our survival. The second attribute of our developmental journey has been the establishment of effective partnerships beyond Singapore. In the early years of our nationhood, Singapore benefited tremendously from the technical assistance and the cooperation from many international partners, such as the World Bank and UN agencies. In the 70s and 80s, training programs with some multinational corporations also helped to raise the skills and the productivity of our workforce. Even our early rollout of the sewerage system in Singapore was also supported by a loan from the World Bank. And one of the conditions of that loan, interestingly, was that the government at that time had to raise the tariffs for the delivery of water and the treatment of used water. So to pay it forward, we started the Singapore Cooperation Program in 1992, and we now conduct around 300 courses per year for 7,000 officials from our fellow developing countries. And this April, we welcomed our 100,000th participant of the Singapore Cooperation Program. When I visited New York in September, I announced the new Sustainable Development Program under the SCP to support the 2030 Agenda. And through this program, Singapore will work with the UN agencies such as the UNDP to provide technical assistance to developing countries in order to further enhance their capacities in the area of leadership and governance, the development of sustainable cities, water, and sanitation solutions. Although Singapore only accounts for about 0.11% of the world's emission of greenhouse gases, we will not neglect our responsibility as a global citizen. In July, we submitted our INDC, the Intended Nationally Determined Contribution, to the UNFCCC Secretariat. Our commitment is to reduce our emission intensity by 36% from the 2005 levels by 2030. And we should stabilize our emissions with the aim of peaking around 2030 as well. Now, mind you, this is not an easy target to achieve. Bear in mind the fact that we're entirely fossil fuel dependent. We do not have geothermal energy. We don't even have enough solar energy. If we were to cover all buildings in Singapore with solar panels using today's current technology, we could generate at best 12 to 15% of our electricity needs. We have no typhoons, so it also means there's a limited amount we can harvest from the wind. Even our intertidal distances are limited, so there's a limit to how much we can generate from tidal energy. And because we don't have earthquakes and no volcanoes in Singapore, fortunately, it also means we don't have access to geothermal energy. So the point I'm making is that the key and most effective strategy for Singapore, in fact, is conservation and energy efficiency. And hence, our target, our declared INDC is expressed in terms of emissions intensity. Now, sustainable development issues cannot be addressed unilaterally. For the 2030 agenda to work, we need the commitment and the concerted efforts of all stakeholders. By that, I mean governments, civil society, and businesses, the people represented here in this room. And that's why this forum is so relevant. Let me be frank and perhaps undiplomatic. I know foreign ministers are supposed to be nice, smiley, diplomatic people, but since I used to be an environment minister, I can be frank, brutally frank. The transboundary haze that has afflicted our region for far too long is a man-made tragedy and a crime. A man-made tragedy and a crime. It would be bad enough if this was a natural disaster. We would all shake our heads, huddle together, reach out and help one another. But this is not a natural disaster. This is a deliberate, man-made tragedy. Vandalism against society, against the environment, and ultimately against ourselves. It has impaired the health of millions of people, compromised the safety of aircraft, damaged our regional economy. This year, it has been estimated that more than 2 million hectares of forests, a lot of which was growing on peatland, and you know that peatland represents millennia worth of carbon captured in our ground. More than 2 million hectares of forests have been set alight. Huge quantities of CO2 have been released, estimated at around 1.6 billion tons of CO2. You know, it pains me to have to travel to Paris to negotiate global agreements, whilst right here in our backyard, we're releasing huge amounts of global greenhouse gases. It puts things in context. And all this is happening because actually only a handful of people, a handful of big companies are really profiting from this entire exercise at the expense of the environment and of the rest of society. This is a classic example of privatizing the gain and socializing the pain. We need a multifaceted solution. At one level, the countries are individually trying to tackle transboundary haze. Within ASEAN, Indonesia has ratified the ASEAN Transboundary Haze Agreement, and we have taken a multilateral approach to attempting to put out the recent fires. But we also need to intensify regional and international cooperation in order to apply effective legal and commercial pressure on these few errant companies so that they will stop their unsustainable and irresponsible land and forest clearing. The haze has also catalyzed a growing demand for responsible and sustainable business practices. The Singapore Environment Council and the Consumers Association of Singapore recently stepped up their efforts to get leading retailers to declare that their products and their supply chains are derived from sustainable sources. This caused retailers to withdraw some products from their shelves, and some companies have also received notices from the National Environment Agency pursuant to Singapore's Transboundary Haze Pollution Act. These may be symbolic. It may not cost the companies a lot of money at this point in time, but I think it sends a very clear signal that enough is enough and that people are going to vote with their wallets and their feet. The Singapore government has also taken steps to review its procurement practices to see how we can support companies that have instituted sustainable practices. And as far as possible, this will take into account the practices not just of that particular company, but of your suppliers in your chain. We expect companies to be transparent about your supply chains, particularly those in the oil, palm oil, and the forestry sectors. And we hope that others in the private sector will likewise practice sustainable procurement and be prepared to subject themselves to the transparency that's needed. The growing chorus for responsible and sustainable business practices is not just a phenomenon peculiar to our region. In many places around the world, in the US, the EU, India, and China, we see a rising trend of consumers wanting goods that are demonstrably sustainably produced and are demanding greater accountability and transparency in the supply chains. And I think this is something to be welcomed. We hope that in response to this growing consumer movement and to the greater need for transparency, that businesses will see that it is in their own long-term interests to move towards a more environmentally friendly behavior characterized by enhanced transparency in the supply chain and procurement processes. At the end of the day, environmental protection, social responsibility, and protecting the health of all stakeholders, citizens, and employees are really in the long-term interests of the companies themselves. And ultimately, we also need to ensure that there is a price to be paid for damaging our health, damaging our environment, and damaging the economy. Sustainable development is not an optional luxury. You've just watched that film. I sometimes have problems when we overly anthropomorphize the problem, meaning we think the universe spins around human beings. The universe and the earth has been around for billions of years, well before human beings came about. It is true that we now live in a day and age that the species of human beings does impact the earth and the environment. But the earth and the environment will survive human beings. The issue is not the survival of the earth. The issue is the survival and the well-being of human beings. That is the real reason why all of us need to believe in sustainable development, in protecting our environment, and in responsible business practices. It's actually about people and about human beings. So we need political will, we need the ability to investigate thoroughly, we need the willingness to enforce effectively, we need responsible business behavior, we need ethical investors, and we need vigilant consumers to pledge our common commitment towards a sustainable future, not for the sake just of Mother Earth, but for the sake of our fellow brothers and sisters. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a most enjoyable and fulfilling time ahead. Thank you.